Right, namaste, people of the world. A very good morning to everybody who's watching us in India and in Bangladesh and in Nepal, and a very good day to everybody in the rest of the world. Uh, Today, as excited as I am to welcome you to the latest edition of the Fair Dialogue, I am equally excited to introduce our guest, Dr. Usha Ramanathan, today, who's backstage and will join us in a few moments. However, I have a daunting task of essentially introducing her because even all of her designations combined and all the words that I can essentially put together will probably not be sufficient to encompass the versatility of the work that she has done and the impact that she continues to create. So before I bring her on, let me introduce you to how we've designed this particular session or how we've designed this particular conversation. Uh, we've tried to design today's fair dialogue to be as open-ended, as versatile, and as intersectional as we can, in line with Usha ji's work and in line with the school of thought that 8-1 and FAIR and the FAIR project were born with. So most of our dialogues have reflected interconnectedness, right? And while they are not in any particular sequence or any particular order, they invariably seem to draw from each other and they connect with each other. So today we will continue with that tradition, obviously. However, what we'll also attempt to do is to take a step back and to look at the big picture, to get the bird's eye view and to look at the constellation as a whole and not just the dots and the lines, because we often forget to do that, right? To see that everything is connected, to see that every small change has a ripple that affects every aspect of our lives, whether it is from something as small as adding our phone numbers to our social media profiles to something as big as the negligence at the behest of corporate greed that leads to the losses of millions of lives. And who better to explain this interconnectedness to us? Who better to teach us to see this constellation as a whole than Usha ji, who not only has an acute sense of observation for these nuances, but is also a seasoned educator for the masses on these nuances. So Usha ji has been at the vanguard of driving awareness and change across sectors, and she has donned the role of a lawyer, an activist, a researcher, a spokesperson, and a thought leader. In fact, she's one of the very few people who actively participate in every stage of the value chain of societal action. And I'm feeling very proud to be able to introduce you to her because she's also worked on something which is very, very close on one particular issue, which is essentially not just close to my heart, but also close to me geographically because she was one of the she was again at the vanguard of the Bhopal gas disaster and, bringing it to the forefront of not just the media, but also the justice system. She's also worked on mass displacement. She's worked on eminent domain and manual scavenging, and she's worked on civil liberties, including death penalty, beggary, criminal law, and custodial institutions, along with the environment and judicial process. In the past, she has also served as the South Asia editor of the Lead Journal, which is the Law, Environment, and Development Journal, which again I think was essentially 10 years ago. But since then, what she has also worked on is she's regularly working with non-governmental organizations such as Amnesty and the World Health Organization as well. And she is a regular speaker, and your most of her discourses are available in the public domain. And I encourage you to go see them, go learn from her. And she's a regular speaker at various universities. She's often called upon by the National Judicial Academy in Bhopal and the Delhi Judicial Academy to address judges on various issues of law and poverty and on technology and the law and the relationship between them. She was also a member of the expert group on privacy setup and planning commission of India, in which basically sent out its report in October 2012. And she also served as a member of committee in the Department of Biotechnology to review the draft on human DNA profiling bill in 2012. Uh, I will still maintain that despite this introduction and despite all of these things combined, it is actually very, very difficult to sufficiently encompass the insight and impact that she has contributed to the lives of people like myself, right? So I am very exhilarated to welcome you, Usha ji. And I'm absolutely certain that by the end of this dialogue, I will be able to defend this argument that this introduction is essentially not going to be sufficient. And what I'm apprehensive of is whether this conversation is going to be sufficient to sort of help us pick your brain and get a little bit of sneak peek into your thought process. So let me welcome you to the front stage. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for taking out the time today. And without any further ado, what I'd like to do is to jump directly into the conversation with your permission. Right, to start us off.
Can I just do this, Aditya? Before you get into the main conversation, can I just ask anyone listening in that they should just shed the hyperbole? Because it's like, you create expectations which may not be capable of being met. So I'm going to request that everybody forgets the introduction and that we just keep the conversation moving. I also have to say this because so many people have worked on the Bhopal gas disaster that I actually didn't start off by being at the vanguard of any of that. I was a young person knowing that something was wrong in Bhopal, but having to learn. So my growing up happened with Bhopal in my consciousness all the time. And therefore, there is a certain amount of contribution I've done. But I can't take more credit than that.
I will not say that I wasn't warned that this is probably something that is going to happen as soon as I introduce you. So like I said, what I'm really happy about though, however, is the fact that the span of work that you've done, and irrespective of whether you see yourself at the vanguard of it or not, but what is essentially certain for us, and what is essentially going to be, I think, evident in this conversation as well, that over the years, with the work that you've done and the discourse that you've created and the narratives that you've created, I've found that most of your articles, most of your interviews that I've seen essentially are a very good source for me to identify the connections between these different things. And it's sort of a very great place for anybody to start with when they're trying to understand, say, policy and so on and so forth. The general discourse that's going on, and even, to see essentially where the media narrative might be slightly skewed, right? And those kind of things are usually evident, and it's very visible in the conversations that you have with people, with the masses. It's available to all of us essentially in the public domain. And again, probably correct me if I'm wrong here, but that despite the work of people like you, most people still miss the big picture, right? Most people still are not able to see this interconnectedness that we were talking about. And most people, when we talk about policy, we talk about bills, we talk about any statement rather by the government, what they will essentially do is they will face a certain mental block because maybe it's jargon written, maybe because it's too open to interpretation, or maybe the media narrative around it is so strong that they do not take the time out to actually go hunt for the facts. So, of course, like I said, if I'm wrong, then I'd be probably much, much happier. But if I'm not, then how do we approach the solution for this particular problem? How do we educate people to regularly see this intersectionality and this interconnectedness?
It's the way you formed that last part of the question is particularly interesting for me, because I often find that we have to get over the barriers that have been set up by our education to be able to get to see the world as it is. Right. And to experience the world, not only through our physical presence in various parts of the world, but also through traveling across time, across space, across experience, through literature, through storytelling, through breaking down borders and barriers. Actually, I think one of the things that I think education is a very important part of our growing up. But I also think that at different points in time, the way we learn for ourselves has to change. So in a classroom, for instance, we will have different subjects that are taught to us. So some of the examples that you had given earlier in our thing was to say, people learn law, people learn about the environment. There is environmental sciences. and then there is maybe coding, or there is history. Now, how do we even, that all these are actually part of a whole, and that these boundaries, that get drawn between these subjects, are things that we have to slowly allow to disappear as our experience of the world, through the various kinds of things that I was saying, as it grows and as we grow, that is maturing, that is becoming adult, that is learning from the experiences of life and all that life provides for us. So the purpose of having boundaries and borders is that it makes it manageable for us. But life is, the world itself is not a manageable proposition. We are not managing the world. In fact, part of the problem that we have today is because human beings have felt that they can manage and control the universe, which we cannot do. We are just part of it. So I think, there are a few things that help. One is curiosity. That never stopping to be curious, never not noticing that one question leads to another, never noticing that a question itself is as interesting as some answers might be, and keeping that curiosity going. That's, the second is incrementalism. We learn little by little. We don't learn everything at one shot. It's not like preparing for an exam just before it. In 1 week, I've studied whatever cram gone, written my paper. Life doesn't work like that. So incrementalism, every day finding something that you've done, which at the end of the day has either been exciting or revealing, or something that we did not know before, or a thought that comes into your head, which then some you want to pursue, some you want to keep with you. That idea of incrementalism, because over a period of time, learning doesn't happen except over time. So we have to allow that learning to happen, for which incrementally we have to keep allowing ourselves to grow. So very often, what in my generation, I don't know how it is now, but in my generation, I can definitely say that, there would be people who would be good students, do well in their exams, learn a lot when they are in college, and then they leave, and then there is a sudden drop in it because we have settled into something else. The settling is a very unsettling process for me. So one doesn't settle, one keeps alive. And that keeping oneself alive means that that there is this incrementalism. It will keep happening. Sometimes what is incremental becomes a leap, it becomes a bound. It's also learning, when you were talking about the work that I do, it's not like I work in multiple sectors. I just don't see that they are different sectors. The starting point was saying, listen, I've done sociology, I've done law. I thought the problems that I saw when I was doing sociology would find some answers in law. Then when I did law, I found, no, actually it creates more problems than it really resolves. So how do I understand this? And then, all these, these borders break down and you start just looking. So I think it is important to acknowledge the wholeness of the universe, and recognize that these borders exist in our mind, and that as we look, as we see, as we explore, actually we end up letting a lot more of life come into us than we can think and plan in advance. It will happen if we let it happen. I'm sorry for an abstract answer, but that's how this happens. And just one other thing, that one of the things that we stopped doing enough is actually thinking. We don't deal with ideas. We don't hypothesize. We want to know. And I think hypothesizing, a hypothesis comes at the end of a process. Hypothesis is not just a beginning. It's the beginning of another process. But to arrive at a hypothesis, we have to have, what is that question? What is it that we are looking for which the dealing with ideas is very important. Learning to think is very important. So knowing facts and creating knowledge are two different things. And I think we need to do both. We do one very well, but we really don't do enough of the other.
I think that's it's probably the first time that I've actually gone beyond this idea of intersectionality to actually think about the world as having no sections, having no sectors, so to speak. And I think, I mean, at least at the surface of it, it seems like a much better thinking framework, right? Because then essentially a lot of, and we've got a question also in chat, which probably points out to that particular thing. Is what we try to do is, before being curious of the problem, like you mentioned, we first try to fit that problem and figure out whose problem it is, essentially, or what problem does this pertain to. So we are so much in the habit of sort of labeling things and pigeonholing things and figuring out which department should be worried about this, whether it's in our office or it's in the government. I think that habit might just go away. That habit to think in that particular way might just go away if we actually look at this in the seamless way that you're talking about. And of course, I mean, we'll probably have to, ask you 1,000 more questions to actually get to implementing that sort of a thought process. I mean, how do we see? Right. But then this is one part, and again, I was looking at this question which came to us from Shivani. This is one part where probably it's difficult to not see, say, the differences, not essentially between sectors, but between different communities and different people, right? And although this question is specific to environment, but I'd ask you to feel free to address it in any through any particular lens. And the question essentially says that, especially for communities who are essentially, say, the underprivileged or the have-nots, as we see them or call them, is it fair for us to ask them to, say, worry about the issues on, say, the top of the pyramid, right? When we are talking about the environment, when we are talking about privacy, when we are talking about surveillance from the state, and so on and so forth, is it fair for us, or can we even expect them to sort of worry about that when they are in the struggle for roti kapda makan on a daily basis? Or so what would be your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll for the moment I'll stick with the question of the environment, because it's actually quite fascinating, and it says a lot. In the 70s, when for the first time the idea of sustainable development was brought into the language of environmentalism, we just adopted it. See, when I say curiosity, we need to figure out why sustainable development. What does it even mean? And you think a little bit about it, and you find that in the world in which we live, it's an oxymoron. If it's sustainable, then there is, the kind of development that's being asked for cannot exist. And if we want to carry on with the kind of development that, that is being espoused today, then it's not going to be sustainable. So what was the logic of the sustainable development? And you find that basically it was saying that there are some entities which have become very powerful. They've become powerful because they've been, money has become very important, and the kind of resources that they are able to bring for, in terms of capital, and being able to create various kinds of industry which produces profit. So there is profit with limited liability, which means you can have extraordinary profits and you have very limited liability. So this has meant that it's very difficult when people acquire that kind of power, where, for instance, American corporations for the longest time had more in their, they were more profitable, and the kind of monies that they had was far greater than many countries in the world. So it's difficult when this becomes the way through which transactions happen and relationships are built up between countries, for countries to be even equal, on an equal footing with corporations. So just imagine what that has done. So just getting curious about what this was, there is a book which was written in the early part of this century called The Corporation. Now, for those of you who are curious and would just like to go and look, it's actually interesting. This Joel Bakan, who's a lawyer, started writing about it because he had the kind of questions, at least in part, that I had. And he actually pursued it. So I didn't need to do it. He did the work for me. And he looked at what it was that allowed the corporation to be the kind of thing it is. It can travel across the world. It can externalize all the costs, which means that, you can cause pollution of air, of water, of rivers. And yet you can carry on with your profitability by leaving all those as external. to what your business is. And when he looked at it, he looked and saw that it was a construction. It was a created thing. The corporation is a creation of statute. And that corporation can make any amount of profit and have very limited liability. So it makes it's a perfect prescription for a lot of power with very little responsibility. And so along with, when he started doing this research, he found that there were visuals, there were things that were being told, which when captured on canvas, not on canvas, but on the screen, on camera, would be far more effective than his writing it. So if you go to YouTube and you look for The Corporation, you'll find that there is a film that was made on that, and it's fascinating. Of course, Joel Bakan's appealed to me more because, this was like something fun that I watched. It wasn't fun, but if you see what I mean. But the book was, told me how technically this is actually being constructed over time. So by the time we came to the time of sustainable development, they were saying that, listen, we understand you have all the power. You have, the law is on your side. We've now created the idea of development only based on corporations and corporate work. And therefore, you will need to do what you need to do, but at least try and make it sustainable. We'll give you some principles. Like we'll say, keep some of these resources for intergenerationality. Other generations too should be able to access it. Take a precaution. If it's likely to poison the whole universe, please don't do it. So it was a compromise that was brought in, but we've just adopted the idea of sustainable development. Then later, after sustainable development was brought in, then there was this question of, okay, so what is in fact causing havoc to the environment? And one school of thought said, we have too much population now. That's the problem. Like it was people, except that it wasn't people. If you look at how much people take and how much they have to do with the environment and what corporations do to environment, there is no connection. So it was profit and not people that was fundamentally the problem. Then they came to this saying that poverty creates environmental issues. And that was quickly knocked off. Because actually, if you look in our country, for instance, it's only the poor who are maintaining our environment for us. Who is the rag picker? Who is the person who's sitting and doing all this dirty work so that, we can live in peace? Every bit of work that is helping us live in peace, large parts of it anyway, are being subsidized for us by the poor. So the environment is actually being far better protected by the poor than it is and the waste is being created. Like America creates much more waste than I think the rest of the world put together. But it's really like huge amounts of waste are created there. So it's not the poor who create that waste. They are not the ones who are despoiling the environment. So ultimately, all these are diversions from what the problem really is. So we need now to go back, and we needed to go back for a long time, to say that, listen, we have to be clear that if we have to safeguard the environment, even if we don't want to do it for the universe, we want to do it so that we can breathe. You think about the number of cities in India where you can't breathe. You wake up in the morning. I grew up in times when they would say, when you wake up in the morning, go for a walk, go for a run. Today, you have to wake up in many of those cities and they'll tell you, don't get out of your houses because it's too polluted outside. We've done this to all the air around us. So when we look at this, I think it's pretty plain where the problem is. We need to have a complete rethink on this idea of development. We need to have, and in law, I know that, we have a strange phenomenon, what we call a deeming provision. A can be deemed to be B by the law. So very recently, I heard that because of the Ukraine-Russia war, apparently in Europe, in the European Union, they are looking now to recategorize gases and nuclear energy as being non-polluting. They are green. Because in the climate change conversation that is going on, we've said that only green is acceptable. So if only green is acceptable, then either you go green or you go wherever you want to go and you call it green. So, this is just to give you a kind of picture of what we are confronted with and how perhaps we need to start understanding what words mean and where many kinds of thoughts are being put into our heads. That's why it's important to think our own thoughts, to do our own, to do our own foraging for whatever understanding we need to have.
No, and I think that again stresses the importance of this narrative that needs to completely change around how people see these things, and a lot of these things which get missed. For example, I had absolutely no clue that apparently nuclear energy is green now. But nonetheless, and I think in line with this particular thought, right, the narrative around it, or the basically the nooks and crannies where essentially people are able to find loopholes within the system. I mean, people in the system are able to find loopholes within the system. And again, with relation to the big corporates, or the corporate greed that we were talking about, we've got one of those questions which probably is in line with what I would like you to address, is with specific to, say, the justice system, right? As sort of or at least what we see it is that it's going to strike a balance between not letting the corporates have an absolute get out of jail free card, and at the same time protect the welfare of the masses, right? But when it comes to just absolute human lives losses and disasters, which I think is very easy to see that are a direct consequence of corporate greed, are a direct consequence of corporate exploitation. But we still find that most of the punishment that is eventually announced does not fit the crime, right? And I mean, Bhopal gas tragedy is one example. You've spoken about it extensively. But then I think we can basically just pick any oil spill in any part of the world, or pick any forest fire or deforestation in any part of the world, any gas leak in any part of the world, and I think the narrative will pretty much be the same, right? That the media will essentially probably inflate what seems to be the punishment, and the media will essentially probably make us like try to convince us that this punishment is essentially befitting the crime, and so on and so forth, and the compensation was provided or rehabilitation was done, and so on and so forth. But more often than not, it just doesn't seem to balance out. So how do we rethink, say, the lens with which the justice system is supposed to view the exploitation by the corporations on the environment and on human lives as well?
Yeah. So, the one of the just two, three things just to set the stage on this. The first is that when these things happen, they're actually happening every day. Every day you'll read somewhere or the other there was a gas leak. It's a smaller number. It's not, the Bhopal gas disaster was compared to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Maybe the others are not of that dimension, but large numbers of people keep getting affected by, dying of gas leaks, of toxic waste, causing havoc in people's lives. This is a very, very common occurrence. In fact, a lot of the time it's happening to us and we don't even know it. So, in fact, when we were working on the Bhopal gas disaster, we were saying, how do we even know? If increasingly they've been saying we won't have one industry in a place, we'll have an industrial area. How do we know which in this industrial area affected the people around? How do we even make that out? Even if we want to say that someone should be held answerable, how do we even do it? And we were told that there are different ways. One is, it's called fingerprinting, which, unlike the kind of thing that we are being made to do now, is about being able to make the connection between that which is causing harm among the people and what is being emitted by a particular industry. So you fingerprint it. You have to make that. So it's a scientific process, and we have to develop the science on this. So developing the science today, like it has for some time, it requires capital. It requires somebody to invest in a laboratory. It requires for that science to be tested over a period of time, it to be authenticated, and then for it to be acknowledged. It's a process, and this requires the control that corporations have over so much of scientific research need hardly be said. And so that is one kind of an obstacle that we find exists in this. The second thing is that, as a people, one of the things that's been noticed, and there was a book that was written called Costs of Accidents by Guido Calabresi years ago, where he made, that was at the time we were working on the Bhopal gas disaster, and at early years of working on the Bhopal gas disaster. And when I read this book, you find that he makes a statement that all of us, I think, need to remember, that till an accident or a disaster happens, we don't think it can happen to us, which means that empathy is not a pre-existing condition in our midst. So we don't automatically have empathy when it does happen to somebody else, because we don't see it as happening to us till it happens to us. Then when a disaster does strike and people get impacted by it, very often, for instance, the Bhopal gas disaster, people continue to have severe reactions to what happened all those years ago in 1984. There is a loss of patience with the victim that happens. And that's another phenomenon that we need to address. Because it's like, okay, it's happened now, they become then a burden on the system. Actually, they've paid the price for us to be able to continue doing what we are doing. And it's not all right for us to continue doing what we are doing. And when we look at these two together, that you don't think it could have been you, and you get impatient with those who have actually become the victims, it produces something that's not very healthy in the making of policy. The second thing is that when we read about it, say in the press, it gets converted into an event or into a spectacle. So it doesn't help thought. It only allows for reaction. And there's a big difference between reaction and response. We need to respond to that situation, instead of which we find ourselves reacting all the time. And the third is that for the state it is pragmatism. If they're going to depend upon, like when Bhopal happened, when the Union Carbide plants spewed out that methyl isocyanate and whatever else it was in that aerosol, the concern of the state, the concern of those who are running the state, was that, well, if we are too harsh with Union Carbide, other companies may not be willing to come, which means that our development will get stunted. So the question was not, do we want poison in our midst? It was, how do we manage the poison and the fallout of the poison when it is in our midst? So the questions determine the answers. And the way the question gets answered, the question gets asked, the answer says that we continue with locating poison in our midst. And that's what's happened now. You can see it all around us. So I think we really, Bhopal taught us so much. We've just been unwilling to learn.
I couldn't agree with you more, and especially on the empathy bit. I think it was a conversation yesterday where we were talking about development, and we were talking about growth, and we were talking about civilization and the evolution of civilization as a whole in one of the internal calls that we have as a part of the FAIR project. And I remember citing this example of Margaret Mead, who was asked in a conference. She's a cultural anthropologist, and she was asked in a conference that what do you consider is the first sign of progress or development in a civilization, or the first sign of civilization itself. And then people were expecting that the answer is going to be fire or the invention of wheel or something, but she ended up saying that it was healing a broken femur. That if a broken femur had healed, it essentially meant that because if you broke your femur, then it means that you cannot walk, you cannot run away from predators, you cannot find shelter. All of nature is against you. So it means that somebody sat down next to you, brought you food, fended off any predators, made sure that you were covered in the rain and covered from the sun, and took care of you essentially. And that's the sign of civilization. And I think that just echoes in what you spoke about empathy, because most people will read through the entire newspaper without actually sitting down and thinking about that this is probably happening in my neighborhood. And Bhopal was definitely a wake-up call for a lot of us.
Can I just come in, Aditya, for half a second?
Please.
You were talking about Margaret Mead, and I was thinking, I've just been reading Rousseau on inequality. He wrote, in a competition that was set up in Geneva in the 1700s. In 1754, he wrote this essay. And it's an essay on the origins of equality and whether it is rooted in nature or somewhere else. And he actually has quite an interesting thing to read, because he says that civilization is what has caused inequality, and civilization is the burden that we are having to bear today. And that, the idea of civil society coming in, and I don't think he meant it the way we talk about civil society, but of there being, not being human beings, not being individuals, and not being, in disparate spaces, but constituting ourselves into a society. He says that itself produces inequality. So what is this, what the way we are in the state of nature requires certain things from us. It requires us to be nimble. We are weaker than some animals and stronger than some. We are, more, we can climb trees better than some animals and less than. So we learn it is still more basic. When we moved out of that stage and we started thinking that we can put systems in place, and, you start organizing ourselves in these kinds of, societies, then we produce various kinds of things which produces inequality. So it was fascinating. I've actually been trying to figure out, one shouldn't just take it as a broad thesis and think it's absurd, because actually there are a lot of things he's saying in that we will recognize when we read it now. And one simple thing is that, you have systems that are created, which the whole system operates for a certain set of people. It doesn't operate for others. So even the question you asked about environment, but there are some countries that are more advanced that have allowed for all this devastation to happen in becoming what they are. And today they say, you don't do it. This also tells us something about how systems get structured. Why is the WTO what the WTO is? Why do we have all these conflicts about, intellectual property? What do they even mean? Right? So I think the idea that institutions and systems and hierarchies are the cause of many of our problems today, and we need to address these, is part of the conversation we are having now. Sorry, I cut in on something you were saying.
No, I think that's that's essentially a very valuable tangent for us to think about, because more often than not, a narrative like this, will probably be just labeled as anarchist, and then nobody would essentially listen to you and then say you can't have a society without a system, you can't have a society without a state, you can't have.
The thing is this, that when you read Rousseau, then you recognize that this is what it is. If you believe in reason, which is what human beings say, then we can use that reason to change it. It doesn't have to conform to these ideas that hierarchy, for instance, is produced.
Right. Right.
I'll give you a simple illustration. There was a book that was written on the American Supreme Court. Okay. So it was called The Nine. It was about one case. I think the Gore versus Bush case. And the first page of that book, he describes what it is to walk up the stairs of the Supreme Court of the United States and enter that magnificent edifice. Okay, so it's like grand, imposing, magnificent, exuding power, exuding authority. Then you have another, which is a film also that all of you might want to see if you haven't already. It is a film that has been made on the Constitutional Court in South Africa. And it is introduced with the person who takes you around and shows you all of it is Albie Sachs, who was a judge in that court, among the first appointees in the court. And when he explains that quote to you, one of the things, there's a lot in it, you can see it, but one of those things he says that the court actually sits in a slightly depressed, it's like a basement, it's like in a depressed space. And there is a line of the window which goes all along, which is glass. And they can see people walking on the street outside. So they are not isolating themselves, they are not. And he says that we sit below the people to know who we are working for. And we sit there, and every time we see, the feet, they are white, they are black, they are stocky, they are thin, they are this, they are that, they are male, they are female, they are covered, they are not. And he says, we look at all of that and we say, that is who we are here for. So it's about the imagination that we have to produce. One imagination produces magnificent edifice, and the other produces, various ways in which they are thinking of what they are there to do, which is to produce justice, and it's for people. It's not an abstract notion when you see people passing by, no?
100%. And I think that lens with which we are actually looking at, the responsibilities that we have and even the rights that we have and like how we are going to use them. I think that lens in itself is, if not more than at least 50% part of the equation of how empathetic we are going to be and how active we are going to be in understanding the impact of the things around us and the impact of any authority that I or you might have, and any change that we might implement, and the visible and invisible impacts of those changes. So I think that's very true. We've got one more question. So I'm gonna jump a couple of tangents. Although I would really want to come back to this conversation that we've found ourselves into. But let's take this question first, which is probably inclining towards this idea of how, I mean, I think it's probably not a very recent narrative. I'm assuming that this has been happening a lot. It's probably come to the surface now, as we were speaking about it a little before the call, that a lot of these things have become very pronounced now. Is when anytime we say decide to raise our opinion, even in support of something and especially against something, which is let's call it the conventional narrative, or let's call it whatever is considered as correct, or whatever is the current social norm. If we are speaking up against it, then the first thing that essentially happens is whoever is on the other side of the conversation, right? They will immediately label us as either based on what our political stance is, what our stance is on, say, religion, what is our stance on the world as a whole. So immediately pigeonholed as soon as we open our mouths and then we share our opinions on anything. And then I think it essentially feels like that every conversation around any opinion that is shared is essentially to peg which side of the line am I standing on, right? That's where the conversation then starts. I mean, the first thing that they would want to know is where do you stand, and then they have the conversation. So for people who are inclined to having these conversations, who have the proclivity for these conversations, how do we, and what would your advice be essentially, especially for our audience, which is essentially very very who are just starting out in essentially implementing societal change? What would be your advice to them to not say lose sight of the cause that they're supporting, especially when their identity is being attacked, especially when the first thing that happens to them is a label is stuck on them, and then more often than not we naturally find ourselves either defending that label or trying to get rid of that label, and then the conversation around the cause just completely takes a sidestep. So what would your advice be to them?
Yeah, actually, I have to confess, I'm not a great person to give advice. I just keep thinking, and I really don't know to couch it as advice. But I'll tell you how I would think about this. The first thing that I find is that othering doesn't happen only by some people of others. Everybody is doing othering now. When we say there are people saying it about us, I find we are saying it about other people too. So this, I'm not sure I entirely agree with you that this always used to happen. And I think this social media has exacerbated it in a way which is completely unacceptable. Actually, I have this thing that a question about knowledge. I mean, it's a slight diversion from what we are discussing, but I think it's kind of relevant to this. When the Human Genome Project was done, they started the project and they wanted to find out about where human beings had started, how the gene had traveled through the world, where it had ended up, what. And at the end of it, they found something that was acceptable to most people with an open mind. That it started from Africa, but so we are all of humanity is one, and that we shouldn't be there is really no great difference between. But sometimes I think, what if that had not been the finding? What if the finding had been that there is some part of the world where actually people say I don't know. I mean, I don't want to name any name because it sounds racist in relation to that. But any part of the world, east, west, north, south, any of these continents, maybe somewhere beyond the Arctic, somewhere which is discovered. What if it had been found that there is a projection of them as human beings, but they are not human in the way in which the genetic project understands it, or that they belong to a lesser or a greater or whatever? Would that knowledge have, is that knowledge that we should have been seeking? And is this seeking of this knowledge okay because we arrived at a conclusion that suits all of us? Is it, I'm not talking about censoring the finding of knowledge. I'm saying, do human beings have the capacity to know what to do with knowledge when they find it? You look at what we have done with the earth around us. When we found that there are deposits under the ground, immediately we started digging it up and trying to destroy it. How did it help us that we had this knowledge? What have we done to the universe with this knowledge? So, there is a way in which we create God, and we think we are in the, we create God in our own image. So we tend to think that we can do all those things that we say God can do. And then we start playing God in the world around us. But the question is, who is the we and who is not the we then? When you say othering can happen in so many different ways. So, while I have a very strong interest and a kind of respect for science, I'm not sure I have the same kind of confidence that human beings know what to do with science. So, even this idea of knowledge and what like take CRISPR technology. Now we want to, produce what we think, it's the kind of thing that happened when the privacy debate happened. And they said, somebody said, oh, well, if you can see everything about a person, then you can figure out who the good person and who's the bad person. And I was like, and who decides what is good and what is bad? Poverty is seen as bad bad by people who see that, who consider poverty to be a drain on their resources. Opulence is considered as something that is seen as not all right by a certain set of other people. So who's good and who's bad? What are we talking about? Are there these universal systems that we've set up which, help us determine any of this? No. So, with CRISPR technology, now to say that we will recreate the human in the form in which we want it, what are we even saying? And then you say, no, there is a moratorium, you can't use it, but people continue using it. So what does knowledge do to the human being? Is the human race capable of handling all knowledge? Even if they are capable of discovering more knowledge than you would think? It's a question, and it's a metaphysical question for me, but it's also a very real question. And I don't think we should be afraid to ask it. We might come to different conclusions. I don't think there are conclusions to many of these things, but we might come to different points. But I think those questions need to be asked. So, and to come back to this thing, therefore, of othering, the one thing is, I think the social media has created, it's created bubbles. It says you're either here or there. I mean, George Bush or whoever said, you're either with us or against us. And we seem to have taken that too literally. I don't know why we allow them to be thought leaders in our universe. So so first thing is actually to know that life doesn't exist in binaries. And if it doesn't exist in binaries, then we can't say you're either with us or you're against us. The second thing is that the great thing about human beings, and I think it's really the most beautiful thing, is that we are so varied. We are so diverse. We are so complex. And that complexity is the texture of the human race. Why would we want to simplify that into a binary? So, in fact, of course, when I thought about the UID project, I was actually saying, why do you want to reduce me into a number? I mean, that's so... They were talking about it like it's a great achievement. And I'm like, what are you doing to human beings? We have so much with us. And, especially in the past 20 years, where we have learned how to deal with this idea of multiple genders, multiple sexualities. We know now that identity is a very fluid phenomenon. Why are we trying to reduce that to me and the other? It doesn't exist like that. So I think first we need to retrain ourselves. I also think that some of these technologies need moratoria because it's bizarre. I mean, I know that there have been some good uses. Some things would never have come to the public view if not for the existence of this. But, there is I don't know. I'm very, very, very ambivalent about some of these new technologies, which are just being unleashed on us because we have them. They are producing many of these problems. And it's always to remember that when we talk about freedom of speech, we made a distinction for many years between the speech of the individual and commercial speech. Now, if you look at what this is doing, it's saying it is as if I'm speaking, but it is Twitter making what it wants with what I'm speaking, what I can speak, how it will put it out, and how it will use it. So I think those distinctions and those, continuums both need to be investigated by us but that will drop the othering from our minds. Yeah.
No, I think, and of course, it's absolutely important for us to, like you mentioned, I mean, realize that it's not as binary as it might seem, or people might make it out to be. But then I agree with you that it's essentially a result of this fast food information culture where, what is more important to me is to find out. I mean, and this is probably a confession. That I would make is that every time like I am essentially on social media and say I am in a debate about something, and this is very early, and now I quit social media completely, but then when I used to be on those debates, at the back of my mind, I would always have this fear of missing out. Is there a better debate going on somewhere else, and then should I be a part of that instead? And that's what most of us are trying to do, right? We follow the traction, we follow the trend, and since we've spoken about social media, I think one curiosity that I've always had essentially is that what they've actually done, and I'll probably like borrow from the Bible or something. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled is to make people believe that it doesn't exist, right? So the same thing is with most of these social media apps, that we don't look at them as companies anymore, right? We don't. I mean, for example, if I open Twitter on my phone, I don't think of Twitter as a bunch of people working in an office trying to sort my information, probably collect data from it, probably profile my behavior, and then give me targeted ads and so on and so forth. No, I see that this is basically my profile, and this is what I say, and this is what this other person says. And what they've actually done very successfully, sort of create this idea of a virtual world for us. And with the metaverse coming in, I really don't know where we're going with that, right? But how do we sort of, and this is actually in line with an earlier question that we had, which Kritika asked, is that people stop beyond a point, right? When they've had the satisfactory amount of information, they will not dig any deeper. And then the inertia kicks in, right? Because they're comfortable. It's easier for them to go through their day while looking at their Instagram reels and not worry about, that how that information is being used, or how this impacts, their identity and their relationship with the state, which is also one of the things that you've spoken about a lot, that people don't think about technology as a tool, which or at least a part of the equation of their relationship with the state. Most people will not look at that. I mean, I don't. I look at Twitter, I look at Instagram, but the Indian government doesn't come to my mind at that particular point of time, that they're actually seeing what I'm doing there. Right? So how do we sort of ask them? You mentioned curiosity, you mentioned empathy, but are there any sort of, say, tangible tools that you've come across, especially when you've spoken about surveillance on social media, when you've spoken about profiling and so on and so forth? And again, now it's become, I mean, the evidence has surfaced now. Now we see the harms of that, even if we could not say about 3-4 years ago. But are there any tangible tools or any, solutions that you found, that people can actually start implementing in their real lives, so that they can be more aware of this? They can actually, say, fact check the kind of information that they're coming across. Are there any ways for me to trace where my information is going? So have you come across any of those things? And it'd be great if you could share some of them.
Yeah. See, the first thing that I'm finding with the technologies that are in our midst today is these are being sent in our midst on the judgment that has been made that people, human beings, are less than they need to be. They are not adequate. In certain circumstances, they'll say people are corrupt, people do money laundering, people do collect black money and keep it. People commit crime, people are terrorists, so if the whole constitution of the construction of human beings around us is done to say, and very interestingly, and I'll just come to that in a minute, but this construction is being done to say that we are not enough, and therefore technology has to come in and take over. That if you can't answer to technology is neutral, and if you're not willing to address technology, then it must be because something is wrong with us. And every day, every time we are being asked to demonstrate that that we are not what they are saying we are, that we are not black marketers, we are not this, we are not that, whatever. But what is even more interesting, and this is what I kind of exclaimed in the middle, is that there is a report that came out last year, which is fascinating. It's called Human Augmentation. I might have mentioned it to some of you before, but it's a report on human augmentation. Augmentation meaning that they want to augment the human being, improve upon what the human being is. And this is being done, and the report has been produced, and I think Germany and the UK have adopted, the defense establishment has adopted it. Because they are saying that, when you go to war, you need to have certain, as a military person, you need to have certain greater capacity to adapt and to be efficient. So they're saying now we need, human beings are not enough. We have to augment them. And the way you augment them is that they have to become compatible with the machine. So to do that, that is a continuum is between the human being and the machine. And to do that, you need to have detailed information about human beings. Only then you can devise these systems. What does that mean? How much water you drink in a day, how long you retain that water, how much sleep do you get, how deep do you sleep, what food do you eat, everything. So if I know all this about the human being, then I will, as the technologist, create systems by which the machine will make up for what I don't have. So essentially, we are passing through a time now where we are being told that the imperfections of the human being, which are legion, now are going to be made up because suddenly we have this technology which can make up for our inadequacies. So this is the kind of projection, and I think, when you say that people are not, that there's an inertia, I don't think it's inertia. I think this is the kind of thinking that has been put into our minds where therefore we use things but we don't know what they are. A farmer always knew what the plow was. A farmer knew how to rectify the plow. Then we went to motor cars where we at least knew that we had to pour water into that radiator and we knew how to make basic repairs. Then they computerized it and we know nothing. Now, the new technologies that are coming in, which are these, earlier we called them information and communication technology. Now they are something different. They are much more. So there is one person, he's in theater, but he's also an activist in the technology sphere, who runs a site called, I'm forgetting now, Speculative Capital, I think. But I'll just check and let you know in a bit. Now, if you go to that site, because that site is interesting. If you go to that site, you'll find that what he's saying is none of us seems to recognize that all of us are all the time producing data for big data companies. And they are getting to know everything. Even when when you shut off your phone and you keep it, they know that you shut it off for that period. Of course, now you also have technologies where they can switch it on themselves. And don't even go that far. Even if you just shut it off, they know how, that the first thing in the morning you switch it on. What do you look at? Do you look at the newspaper? Do you look at WhatsApp? Do you say good morning? They know everything about every part of your day. And he says, you're producing all this data for free for all these companies. Why are you doing it? Do you even realize who you are in relation to these companies? And then he goes on to something that's quite chilling. He says, the idea of work has changed with this AI. And so a lot of jobs are going to fall by the wayside. Now, if they fall by the wayside, where will the worker go? The worker will go and the labor that they have to produce, that they have to contribute, will have to be something that's relevant to the changed circumstance. So he actually has, in that first opening page, he has a thing where he has people who are lying on a plank with they're covered in fur. And what he says is that the only labor that will be valued from now on, one of the things that will be valued is production of heat. Because if you take blockchain technology, it requires so much energy that you have to keep producing more and more energy. So the job that the workers will do will be actually to cover themselves and stay in a way where they manufacture heat. That's what human beings will be reduced to. I mean, it's a kind of sci-fi kind of, bizarre scenario. But is it all that bizarre? And what are we doing? Why are we going on? To many of my friends, I ask, so why do you carry your phone wherever you're going for a walk? Why do you need a phone? And they say, oh, but I need the phone. And why? Because wherever you go, you're giving the geolocation, you're giving the speed at which you're walking, the calories but why do you want somebody to know all this? And you're right, they're not even thinking that it's going somewhere. So the difference, for instance, I found between working on issues of land and other resources and working on data as a resource is that when land was tangible, we knew when it was getting lost. We knew it have no clue. What we don't see, there wasn't it. This is why I think beyond what we can see is we have grown older, but we have not grown up.
Ushaji, I think your internet, your connectivity started lagging for a bit. So we lost the last
Is it
10
okay?
seconds of what you were saying.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't remember what I said, so I'll just let it pass. It couldn't have been some great profound thought. So, but can you hear me now?
Yeah. We can hear you now. The last thing that I could catch was essentially when you said, that people take their phones outside and they don't see that this data is actually going somewhere. And the fact that, like most people are not, you were talking about some insight that you were mentioning specifically to treating data as a resource, because land as a resource, you can see, and you can see when it's
Right.
being taken away from you, but data, you can't. Yeah.
Correct. So because it's not visible, because you can't see it, you don't recognize it as a resource. Whereas all that you're doing is constantly being converted into that resource by people who you don't know. And actually, in fact, you're going back to those people in a completely different form, because you recognize them as providers of a service. You don't recognize them as people who are actually taking over just think about it. We have a population of 7 billion approximately in the world, and more than between 2 and 3 billion are on Facebook. And Mark Zuckerberg, who I will say very little about, and I'll ask you to go back and look. We are handing over our information to young Mark Zuckerberg. How do you feel about it? Listen to him in a few places. Listen to what he's saying in Congress in the US. And then tell me if you really want to give your information to Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, seriously?
No, I think, and of course, this is probably one of the things that essentially ends up happening in most people. They'll be very, very proud of the fact that we get these services for free and you don't have to pay for anything. And these people are, and again, I think this
So,
was also.
So let me just ask one question. If all that we are getting is for free, how are those companies and those people becoming
Exactly.
so rich?
That most people will not ask that question. They will never ask that question. And the most that they'll go to is, "Acha, theek hai, there's advertising, and then other companies pay them so that they run targeted ads and everything." And that's essentially only the
Targeted ads come because of information about us.
absolutely.
But
So we
if I
only
can
get.
just say one thing, Aditya, it's that I think we need to think seriously about technology as being a tool and not being what tells us how to live. It's a tool. Treat it like a tool. When you needed earlier to make a call, you pick up the phone, you make a call, and then you put it down and you carry on with your life. Now we're doing everything through that mobile phone, and we think it is now our master. We can't do without it. We can do without food for a couple of days, but if you don't have your mobile phone with you, this mass hypnosis that this has created, I think we really need to investigate it. I keep thinking, how many things are there which across the world, if you can think in history, across the world, everybody felt that they had to possess. How many things have you thought of? Everybody wants to possess a mobile phone. Everyone wants to possess a laptop or whatever. Why? What is it that has made us feel this way? It's not a natural feeling. If it were a natural feeling, we would have seen it before. Why is it only come with the influx of technology that everything that comes we feel we must have? Everything that is opened up, we feel we must be there. It's never been like this before. If there were 10 sports club, you went to the club where which played the sport you play. You didn't go to 10 sports club. Why is it suddenly important to belong to all 10? I think we need to pause and think what it's being done to us. And if we don't recognize that, then it means that we are, it's a kind of return of something that's a form of slavery, And we should think whether that's where we want to be.
Right. And I think, what makes it worse is that we're actually giving our own consent, to become slaves.
It's not consent anymore. Once
no, it's not consent.
It's Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah, it's Stockholm syndrome. I think that's a great way to describe it. That's so true. So, although we're a little past the 12-hour mark, but then since I already had your permission before the session, and then that we have a little bit of your extra time, so I've got one question that we always ask most of our guests when we engage with them in a dialogue, which is essentially the crux of the FAIR project, with 8-1 and UNESCO. And that question essentially is, what would you, or how would you essentially describe the idea of fairness, or what is fairness to you, is how we usually put it. So if we could have your thoughts on that, I think that's probably going to, and tie in a lot of these things together, because we have been speaking about this lens with which we should look at the world, what is fair and what is unfair. So how would you, if you had to say, define the idea of fairness for yourself, how would you do it?
Well, fairness, first of all, requires a certain element of honesty. Because if we bluff to ourselves, like we tend to do a lot of the time, then fairness can't emerge from that. And I'll give you one illustration where there were some students who had come, and they were, they got off a train and they walked down a road, and they went to a place where they were meeting with some people who were, who were going to explain to them about, the phenomenon of begging and the phenomenon of homelessness. And the students went there, they got, they had an orientation, and then they were taken on a tour of the city. And in the evening when they came back, one of them stood up and said, "I'm speaking on behalf of all students. And we want to say that we are ashamed. I mean, we are ashamed in the sense we are feeling a sense of shame, not ashamed. Ashamed is too strong. But we're feeling a sense of shame because in the morning, when we left the station and walked, to this place, we didn't even notice the people who were on this, who were sleeping on the street, who were sleeping on a flyover on the projection that, that abuts from the flyover. We didn't even, they were there, but we didn't even see them. And we reached here when we were taken out and we were shown that these people are here. It's only then that we realized that they had been there in the morning too. And it hadn't even registered itself in our consciousness. So I think the inability, we have to be honest that there is that kind of poverty around us. We can't hide ourselves from it. And so therefore the first thing is that we have to confront the world which we live in and where we are in that world. Many of us, and I'm sure all the people who are part of this conversation, are people with a certain level of privilege where, even getting educated to a certain extent is a huge level of privilege. And there are many people who don't have it. So this fairness requires recognition. So, for me, the first rule, therefore, is that I must be willing to recognize the world around me as it is and not hide from the truth of that. The other thing is that I think the thing that drops off, and for many of us, it's like we have to learn how not to let it drop off, is recognizing dignity in every human being. Every human being. The third thing is that, the Rawlsian principle, in a certain sense, when John Rawls said that, and what Gandhiji said about the last person, if you can't account for the last person, there is something wrong with the way we are thinking. Nobody is irrelevant. Nobody is dispensable. Nobody is redundant. These are people. If we don't recognize humanity in human beings, what are we going to? Where are we going? What are we doing to ourselves? Humanity doesn't vest only in certain human beings who manage, who happen by birth and by created circumstances to be in a better position to manage this world than some others. And for me, as a visual thing, I think the most unfair thing that I saw was when the migrants walked home. I was thinking, what could have been going through the minds of people who were prepared to immediately set off walking 1,200 kilometers when they didn't think the state would do anything, and they didn't think the people around them would do anything to keep them in body and soul. What does it say about us? And that image, I think, is something we should never, ever, ever forget. I mean, it says what is so wrong with the way in which we've been leading our lives, and it also tells us that it is possible to change it. That's too morose. I think we need a little twinkle in the eyes.
I was just going to say that this is it essentially strikes a perfect balance between what we idealistically want, but at the same time what is realistically around us. And I think of course it's a somber
We
note.
create our own realities, and I think we need to change those. These realities are not okay. Where we are today as the human race is not okay. So why should we adopt it? We can reject it.
Yeah, and like you said, it begins with essentially realizing that it's not okay and telling ourselves that it's not okay. The current reality, we are dissatisfied by it. So I think at least as a starting step, what we can do is sort of get more and more people dissatisfied with the status quo, so that we can at least get them to start thinking in a particular direction, and then maybe that will start inspiring change. But
if I can just say one thing, Aditya, I think in all this, the one thing we shouldn't lose is our sense of humor. Because sometimes it can be so overwhelming.
It is.
And then we realize that, okay, we are one element in this whole thing. And it's a sense of humor and also of awe. When, I just find it stunning that we take this for granted, but every day the sun rises. I mean, I find it so difficult to rise every day, and I'm thinking the sun rises, it sets, the moon comes, the birds at 4 o'clock in the morning, the birds are chirping away all over the place. The oriole will be heard but not be seen. It's stunning. So I don't think we should lose our sense of awe. The world around us is actually much more than just us. And once we see that, it's much happier to live too.
I completely agree with you. And I think there's this one quote that I really, really love. It was essentially a part of this cognitive therapy training that I was undergoing. And this trainer of ours said, one of the problems that most of us have, or which is like a general problem in human behavior, is the fact that we overestimate our ability to surprise others and underestimate their ability to surprise us. Right? So I think that's a great way to just look at it, and then remind ourselves that people will end up surprising us. People around us will end up and the little things that we do and the little things that we see essentially, and if we can, like you said, maintain that awe around us and sort of remind ourselves that it's a great place to be essentially, if we make it so. Right? I mean, it can be built better. So I think that essentially seems like a more optimistic note for us to end on, right?
If I can just say one thing to that, not if we make it so. It is awe-inspiring anyway. We just have to learn to see it. So
that's also true. Agreed.
Yeah. So it's actually even more hopeful than you make it.
Right. I think that, yeah. So the added pressure essentially goes away, and then you can just sort of experience it as it happens, right? Yeah. I agree with you there, 100%. So I think that note essentially is a great place for us to leave our viewers with right now, because I think it helps them. I mean, given the fact that a lot of things that we spoke about, they were issues which were very charged with debate, very emotionally charged, and then a lot of these issues were also very close to home as well. Right, from the Bhopal gas tragedy to social media to the Aadhaar Act, and then finally when we spoke about the situation of the migrant laborers in COVID, and I think something that we've all followed, and I'm assuming that most of the viewers would essentially have not forgotten these things, is at least what I can be certain of. But despite that, we found a way to sort of end on a note of hope, and I'm assuming that our viewers will essentially, be grateful that despite all the heavy and charged conversation, we could at least find a place where we can look at the world with a little bit of hope, right? And like you said, I think as much as fairness is about honesty, as much as fairness is about calling a spade, it's also equally important for us to have hope in order to build a fairer world. So what I would like to do at the end is to thank you, not just for being a part of this conversation, for taking our time today, but for your tireless efforts over the years in helping us build this fairer world. And then what I would always be on the lookout for, and I'm assuming that most of our viewers would also be on the lookout for, is to essentially join in this mission with you and find ways to continue, picking your brain and then collaborating with you and learning from you, and working on the ground with you, essentially, if the opportunity presents itself. And I think all of us can essentially then be a part of what you originally mentioned, right? A seamless movement, a seamless humanity, so to speak. So thank you so much, Usha ji, for taking out the time today. And thank you so much to all our viewers who are watching live, and to everybody else who's going to watch this later on YouTube once we update it. Thank you so much, everyone. And we will see you in the next Fair Dialogue. Thanks a lot.